Good afternoon. It is September 6th, and this is episode 6 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob. Last episode, we talked about Typhoid Mary, and I wanted to stay with interesting individuals for an episode or two. Today's interesting individual is not famous for spreading a virus around. He's famous for surviving. But he didn't survive a virus or a pandemic. He survived something much worse and much more intense. His name is Tsutomu Yamaguchi. And that is probably not a name that you recognize. It's Japanese, you may take it from that. And I can tell you that at 93, he died in 2010. Still can't place the name? Well, he should be one of the most famous men in the world. I first learned about him from a Colbert Report episode back in 2010, a segment that was titled, "We Finally Got Him." Dark humor, to say the least. And it's dark humor because Mr. Yamaguchi is the only recognized person to survive 2 nuclear bomb blasts. Now, of course, the atomic bomb has only been used twice ever in warfare, although thousands of times in testing. And maybe there have been people nearby when those bombs went off in testing. But only one man has the recognition officially from the Japanese government of having survived both nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How can one man be so lucky and so unlucky at the same time? Well, Mr. Yamaguchi lived in Nagasaki and he worked for Mitsubishi Heavy Machinery. But during the summer of 1945, he was on a 3-month-long business trip to Hiroshima. Now, you may or may not know this, but both of those cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were on the list of attacks for atomic bombs because they were relatively untouched by previous Allied bombing, and they were both centers of industry. On August 6th, 1945, Mr. Yamaguchi was headed to the train station because his business trip in Hiroshima was over. But he had forgotten his official travel stamp, something that was needed for him to get home to Nagasaki. So he turned around and went back to work to get it. At 8:15 that morning, he was walking along the docks when the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy over the city of Hiroshima. Mr. Yamaguchi, in a later interview, said he remembered seeing the plane fly overhead and hearing it, and then he saw 2 parachutes, and right after, a bright flash. From his place on the docks, he was about 3 kilometers away from the center of the city, the 3-way bridge that was the target of the Enola Gay bombing. His eardrums ruptured. He suffered burns on one side of his body, and he was temporarily blinded. When he came to after the bombing, he made his way back to his compatriots, and they spent the night in an air raid shelter, without medical care, without food or water. The next morning, they went back to Nagasaki, where he finally got medical care for his wounds. And 2 days after that, he reported to work. And in fact, at 11 a.m. on August 9th, he was arguing with his supervisor at Mitsubishi Heavy Machinery about the fact that a single bomb could destroy an entire city. His supervisor did not believe that was possible and said he must have been mistaken and it must have been a lot of bombers and a lot of bombs. And at that moment, Boxcar dropped Fat Man on the city of Nagasaki. Being at his workplace put him once again 3 kilometers from ground zero of the bomb dropping. The bandages that had been placed over his wounds nearly sealed to his skin, and he was unable to replace them. He suffered from a high fever and continuous vomiting for a week from his second high dose of radiation. His wife was also a survivor of the Nagasaki bombing. In 1957, he was officially recognized as a survivor of Nagasaki, his home city, by the Japanese government when they began identifying survivors of the nuclear blast. Happy that he had been recognized for his suffering, he didn't press the issue that, in fact, he had survived not 1, but 2 atomic bombings. In 2006, a documentary producer made a movie that was called Double A Bomb Survivors, and it was about people who had been impacted by both bombs. During the research, they realized that Mr. Yamaguchi had in fact survived both bombings. 3 years later, in 2009, he applied for double recognition with evidence that he had been both in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in fact, very close to ground zero on the days of those bombings. He was awarded double recognition as a survivor of both bombs and the only person to have that recognition. Later in life, he suffered from a loss of hearing in his left ear that never returned. He had temporary baldness that, although his hair returned, never in the fullness that it had been before. His daughter said she remembered him constantly being covered in bandages until she was 12 years old. Throughout his life, he suffered a number of medical problems that were likely related to radiation exposure. His wife suffered as well. And in fact, even his children have suffered through medical problems that may be related to DNA problems because of the radiation. In 2010, his wife died of liver and stomach cancer. Likely, this cancerous cells were caused by the massive radiation dose she received much earlier in her life. And in 2009, he learned he too had stomach cancer. And he died January 4th, 2010, still living in Nagasaki at the age of 93. The latter part of his life, he became a nuclear abolitionist. In many interviews, he would claim, "Who better than I to speak out about nuclear weapons?" There was some controversy in 2011 when a British show aired a segment making fun of him for having survived both bombings. But you'll remember, I came to learn his name from a Colbert Report episode in 2010, celebrating the fact that we finally got him. So no matter how bad things may look, no matter how bad you may be feeling, no matter how much quarantine has impacted you, just remember, Tsutomu Yamaguchi survived 2 nuclear weapon attacks, and he is the only recognized person to have that accomplishment. He lived his life as an abolitionist against nuclear weapons and died at 93, making the same claims he did his entire life. Things could always be worse, and a lot of our experiences are about how we perceive them. Are we going to be an active participant, or are we going to let things happen to us? That's all for today. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Rob Explains. Make sure you're following us on social media at Rob Explains on all social networks. Got a comment, a question, a subject for a future episode, or did I get something wrong and you want to correct me? Send me an email, rob@robexplains.com, or leave a comment down below, and I'll get to those as soon as this show goes up. Don't forget, new episodes daily. Make sure you're subscribed so those get downloaded directly to your device. But until next time, thank you for joining me. Make sure, take care of yourselves and each other. It's what Mr. Yamaguchi would have wanted. Have a great day.